Every year, the Hall of Fame sparks endless debates. We spend countless hours arguing over who belongs, dissecting every stat, every accolade, every moment of a player's career, and then comparing them to the game's all-time greats. It's one of the most passionate conversations in baseball. But before we can even start those debates, we need to understand how players actually get there. What does it take to be eligible? How do the votes actually work? And why does it feel like some players are held to a higher standard than others? Let's break it down. So let's take a look at how players even make the Hall of Fame in the first place. Officially, to be eligible, a player needs to have played 10 years and retired for more than 5 seasons. Then you have the voting process. Players are on the ballot for 10 years and need over 75% of the baseball writers of America to vote you in. If you fail to reach 5% of the votes, then you're off the ballot. If after 10 years you're now elected, then you can make it through one of the era committees. It's a team of 16 voters, and you need 12 or more to make the Hall of Fame, and at least 5 to stay on the ballot. Easy enough? No, not really. You still need to have a Hall of Fame worthy career, with accolades, dominance, and prescription history is also quite big. However, one of the biggest measures for a career are counting stats. Think your 300 wins, 3,000 strikeouts, 500 home runs. They've long been the gold standard, but it's not entirely true. Although it may not sound as nice as 3,000 hits, really, to get in the Hall of Fame, it's been the 2,880 hit club. Let me explain. When going through the hits leaders list, we see that everyone, not including PED or betting scandals, with at least 2,880 hits has made it into the Hall of Fame. The first person out being Omar Vizquel. So we can make a new quote-unquote quota based on how the Hall of Fame has historically voted. When looking at the rest of the stats, we see Vizquel also was the first guy cut on the games list, where he ranks 13th. Last guy in is Dave Winfield with 2,973 games played. Here, we can see the rest of the classic hitting stats. The first player who missed the cut, their rank in the category, what stat was the last in, and what the traditional milestone has been. By making the chart like this, we can see what the Hall of Fame voters actually prioritize. Hits, RBIs, and home runs are important, but games and walks, not so much. It also is interesting to see how impactful WAR is. Obviously, it's a pretty all-encompassing stat, but the top 82 hitters are all in the Hall of Fame. Cubs shortstop Bill Dolan being the first one out. Interestingly, his WAR at shortstop is the 11th most, ahead of names like Jeter and Banks, so maybe he actually should be put in. Now, if we do the same with pitching stats, we see these traditional milestones actually hold more true. Everyone with 300 wins has made the Hall of Fame, and besides Schilling and his massive problems, everyone in the 3,000 strikeout club has made it. On the pitching side also, a lot of these stats become skewed by players in the early history of the league. They throw 60 games in a season, and they overwhelmingly make up a lot of the counting stats. I also hypothesize the further in time we go without starting pitchers having the same longevity will only increase old-timey players making it. In 20 years from now, I think the Hall of Fame will look at players like Tommy John with his 288 wins and 3.34 ERA and put him in. Now, these counting stats are important, but it's become outdated for modern MLB. To show this, let's play America's favorite game show. Who's that player? The mystery player has 1,700 games, 2,200 hits, 1,400 runs, 1,500 RBIs, 360 home runs, 800 walks, and 79 WAR. You guessed it, it's Joltin' Joe DiMaggio. Now let's look at how he compares to the last Hall of Famer made from the previous charts. On every single category, except WAR, he is below the threshold we made. Now we could say DiMaggio could be overrated and doesn't deserve all the hype he gets. He is, after all, recognized as an upper echelon Hall of Fame player. To that, I'd argue he's one of 10 players to win 3 MVPs, was a 13-time All-Star, and made 9 World Series. Won 9 World Series, all while being the face of the Yankees. And the reason those stats don't compare well is because he missed 3 years of his prime fighting in World War II and retired at age 36. Here lies the big problem with basing Hall of Fame and counting stats. Players don't play enough games nowadays. Here we have a chart with average career length of MLB hitters. We went through all players who qualified for the batting title, around 500 at-bats, and looked at how long of a career they had. Starting on the far right in the 20s and 30s, we see it stay stable at 12 years. Then in 44, we're hit with a drop during World War II. After that, it peaked in the mid-70s, where the top 150 hitters were averaging over 15 seasons in the majors. And it's been on a slow decline, except for the PED bump in the 90s. Now, obviously, the reason 2024 is so much lower is because all the active players haven't finished their careers yet. But it is worth noting that of the players from 2009, Justin Turner and Andrew McCutchen are the only active players. And even from 2010, it's only Stanton, Freeman, Hayward, and Carlos Santana. Now, there is the trend of teams locking up their young talent for 10-plus year contracts, so maybe there is hope of players playing a while, but teams have been phasing out the mid-level vet in favor of playing younger players. They're cost-controlled and have potential, so it doesn't make sense for them, but we probably won't see players bouncing around from team to team in the later stages of their career. Now, going back to our Joe DiMaggio example, when we look at DiMaggio's WAR and compare him to the other center fielders, he fits the profile for career WAR and peak WAR. He ranks 7th out of 19 center fielder Hall of Famers. However, he really shines in the WAR per 162, where he has 2 more WAR per season, highlighting how impactful he was when he played. So, seeing this WAR, and especially how Baseball Reference compares Hall of Famers, you could say to get into the Hall of Fame, you need to have more WAR than average. Makes sense, be better than the precedent set. However, this leads to an issue of the bar for getting into the Hall of Fame constantly being raised. For example, we see this by looking at the average WAR for inductees now versus 2001. We can see that the average has slowly risen for all position players except for second base and right field, and the biggest difference being at third base, where it's gone up by 4.5 WAR. This actually plays out well for first base. The average WAR for first baseman is 65 from the 25 players who made it. Pujols is a slam dunk Hall of Famer when he becomes eligible. However, after he and his 101.3 WAR is added, the new average Hall of Famer gets moved up from 65 to 66.4. This isn't a huge difference, but it might be the difference for players like Votto and Goldschmidt making the Hall of Fame. They are sitting around that number, and the farther they are from it, the harder their case becomes to make the Hall. By the way, just a bit of a side rant. Why are positions in baseball separated so much compared to other sports? Just because someone plays catcher, should it be easier for them to make it compared to third baseman? Like, in what other sport is it easier for niche positions to be inducted? Players have roles, but should it be easier for a point guard to make it versus a center in basketball? I don't think so. Especially in today's MLB, where players are playing all over the field, should we even still consider positions relevant for the Hall of Fame? For example, Joe Mauer being judged as a catcher versus first base and DH. He played 50% of his games as catcher, but if he was considered a first base or DH, the criteria would have been much harder to make. Like, here's a box plot of the Hall of Famers by position. The X in the middle marks the average, the middle line marks the middle number, top of the box is 75th percent quartile, and bottom is the 25th percentile. Here we see Mauer's line and how he compares more favorably as a catcher than the rest. Also, just analyzing this, catchers have a lower median and average WAR than most other positions, reflecting that catchers accumulate huge WAR totals. We see that center fielders and right fielders have some of the highest outliers, meaning a few historically great players, think your Willie Mays, Babe Ruth, Barry Bonds, really skew the top end. Shortstops and second basemen have a narrower spread, meaning Hall of Fame players at these positions cluster more closely in WAR compared to outfielders or first basemen. So, realistically, to solve this issue, I'd suggest it would make more sense to compare the median Hall of Famer than average. This way, the swings in WAR aren't changed as much by outliers. Now that we've gone through the ways that players make the Hall of Fame and highlighted issues throughout the process, let's take a look at another glaring issue with the Hall of Fame. How many people make it? Historically, from the Hall of Fame classes, they've averaged 2.8 players per year. Have had 8 classes without electing anyone, and the most they've ever elected has been 11. There have been a wide variance in the classes, and seems pretty arbitrary how many people make it in. If a player is good enough, they should make it in the first or second year. There should be no difference of a player making it in year 4 versus year 10. But don't tell Billy Wagner that and having to wait 10 years to make it. Since baseball views each generation as their own separate era, I believe there's 2 ways of going about elections. You can say there's a hard cap of how many players make it from each generation, or you can say there's a top percentage of players from each generation should make it. For the hard cap, here we see a chart of how many players in the MLB by season made the Hall of Fame. We see on the right, starting in the 1800s, there weren't so many that made the Hall of Fame. It started to pick up, and by the late 20s, we saw the most amount of Hall of Famers by year, staggering 58 players from 1929. For context, with only 16 teams in the MLB, that's on average 3.6 Hall of Famers per team that year. That's just ridiculous amount of numbers. Then we see a drop-off by the 50s, with only 30 players in the MLB making the Hall of Fame, picked up and remained constant from the 70s to 90s. Then there's the obvious fall off of players once we get to the 2000s, because they're still active and haven't retired yet. Now this kind of works, but this doesn't take into account that MLB has grown in size, by addition of more teams, but also in terms of talent pool, by first breaking the color barrier, and more recently tapping into the Asian markets. To take this into account, here is the same list, but with percentage of the league that made the Hall of Fame. The league expansion of teams and players pool becomes apparent here, and here it is overlaid on top of each other. We see that as the number of Hall of Famers leveled off in the 80s, this wasn't as reflected in the overall percentage of players to make it. Now obviously, we don't know what the future will hold with the players. More players will be making the Hall of Fame through various veterans committees, and the new quote-unquote era is not done. But we see the Hall of Fame is becoming much more selective over time. So that brings us here. What does this mean for the future? If we're saying from our previous start that 7% of the league makes the Hall of Fame, that means we need to find 7% of the 780 players in the MLB. So that means there would be 54 players that are currently playing right now that should be in the Hall of Fame. This brings us to our favorite game that will be 100% accurate with zero chance of aging terribly. Guess every single Hall of Famer who is playing right now. To split this up, we'll do it based on 3 groups of 18 players and 7-year intervals to get to our number. So for the first group, we have the age 34 and up. Pujols, Verlander, Cabrera, Greinke, Scherzer, Kershaw, Freeman, Arenado, I believe are all locks. Molina has an interesting case because I think one of the 3 catchers between him, Posey, and Salvador Perez should get in. And I think Molina, with playing the most games, probably would get the edge, and I could see a world where he's not the one to get in and maybe Posey or Perez gets in. We mentioned also earlier the case for Votto and Goldschmidt, and I think they both make it here. DeGrom, with a great year and probably 2 more years, makes it in the modern pitching era. Same with Cole and Sale. They both have been the best, and they just need a couple more years just to get those counting numbers up a bit. Jansen and Chapman, I think, are the relief pitchers that make it, especially with how important they've become in the modern MLB, and especially for them too, how long they've done it. Altuve, I think, is almost a lock. Just depends if the writers want to punish him for the cheating, but I think he gets in. And Stanton, assuming if he gets to the 500 home runs, I think he gets in. So now the next age range from 27 to 33. This is where it gets a little more difficult. You're kind of projecting pretty much halfway through their careers. So I believe Trout, Judge, Betts, Machado, Ramirez, Harper, and Ohtani are all pretty much locks at this point. Then after that, it gets a little difficult. I think Bogarts, Turner, Chapman, Lindor, Bregman, Seager, Olsen, Correa are all kind of in the same category where they all have like these high 30s to 50 WAR. And at this point, you would say, no, they're not Hall of Famers, but they're all locked up for contract for a couple more years at least, probably 4, 5, 6 years. And they will get those games played, assuming no catastrophic injuries. So just projecting it based off of that, I think a bunch of those guys get in. Obviously not all of them, but, some of them, most of them will. I think Nola and Skubal also, there really isn't that much pitching in this range. This is kind of like the lost era of pitching. So I think those 2 are best chances. And then I think Acuna also, the WAR right now is not there, but he is electric when he plays. And if he could get somehow to, 4 or 5 more just healthy years, I think he's going to get in. And finally, the under 26 players. This is going to be atrociously bad looking back. I think Soto, lock. Other than that, this will just be bad. I think Guerrero, Tatis, Witt, and maybe Julio, but the regression this year hitting-wise, I don't know. I think Guerrero, Tatis, Witt are on very good paths. I think Julio, Gunnar Henderson, Skeens, De La Cruz, Corbin Carroll are the next tier. I think those guys are just good young players that should play a while, hopefully, knock on wood. So I think those are the next group that I would say. Then Hunter Green, James Wood, Garrett Crochet. I think, just talent-wise, watching them play, you're like, all right, these guys are great players. And then finally, I think Kurtz and Wu. I don't know. I just like watching these guys. I'll stand by. I think they're Hall of Famers. And then minor leagues. This is just stupid. I'm not even gonna go through this. I didn't want to just pick the top 4 prospects in the top 100. So I kind of looked at stats a little bit. You know, all right. Well, these are my guys. Yeah. Please don't ever screenshot this, send me any of these pictures ever again. Just let this die here. Anyways, thanks for listening, and hopefully you learned something.